The letter hit the floor of the Sullivan kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, and everything rippled outward from that single moment. Rose Prescott stood in the doorway with mud on her boots and her travel bag still in her hand, and she stared at Jeremiah Sullivan the way a person stares at something that has hurt them so badly they cannot quite process the pain yet. Her brown eyes were bright with a fury she was barely holding behind her teeth, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins during the long wagon ride from Harlow Station, and she looked nothing like the composed schoolteacher he had expected. She looked real. She looked dangerous. She looked like she was about 2 seconds from turning around and walking right back out into the Arizona heat. "You lied," she said. Her voice was low and controlled in the way a river is controlled just before it floods its banks. Jeremiah Sullivan was a man who had faced down cattle rustlers, a collapsing barn in a lightning storm, and 3 years of raising 3 boys alone after his wife had left this world. He was not a man who frightened easily. But something about the way Rose Prescott said those 2 words made the blood drain from his face. "Miss Prescott, you wrote to the Harlow County Board of Education, and you told them you needed a schoolteacher for a proper schoolhouse," she said, and she set her bag down on the floor with the deliberate care of someone who did not trust themselves to be gentle. "You told them you had 7 children in need of formal instruction within a 5-mile radius. You told them the school building was completed and stocked with materials. It will be. There is no schoolhouse, Mr. Sullivan." She pointed through the open door toward the flat scrubland behind the house. "There is a half-built frame with no roof and no floor, and what appears to be a family of prairie dogs living inside the one completed wall." The silence that fell between them was the kind that had weight to it. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of something crashing, followed by a high-pitched argument conducted entirely in furious whispers, followed by what was very clearly a child attempting to pretend that nothing had happened. Rose Prescott looked toward the interior of the house. Then she looked back at Jeremiah Sullivan. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, not yet, because she was far too angry for softness, but something. "Are those your sons?" she asked. "2 of them," he said carefully. "The 3rd one is likely hiding in the barn because he heard the wagon and he does not want a teacher." She was quiet for a moment that stretched like pulled taffy. "Mr. Sullivan," she finally said, "I have traveled 4 days on a coach that had a broken spring, eaten food I cannot identify, and arrived to find that the position I accepted does not technically exist yet." She paused. "Give me one reason why I should not send a telegram to the board first thing tomorrow morning and have them post me somewhere else." Jeremiah Sullivan looked at this woman standing in his doorway with the late afternoon sun turning her hair to fire at the edges, and he told her the truth. Not the careful, curated version of the truth he had been composing in his head for the past 3 weeks since he had sent that letter. The raw and embarrassing version. "Because my boys need someone," he said, "and I have run out of people to ask." 3 weeks earlier, the Sullivan Ranch had been moving through the ordinary chaos of a late spring morning in the Arizona Territory in the year 1883. The cottonwood trees along the dry creek bed were putting out their soft green leaves, and the air still had the last cool edge of the night in it. And Jeremiah was standing at the fence of the south pasture, watching his eldest son attempt to explain to a horse why it needed to accept a saddle. Eli was 14, and he was built like his father, broad through the shoulders with hands already growing into a man's hands, and he had his mother's stubborn jaw and his father's refusal to admit defeat. He had been talking to that horse for 20 minutes. Thomas, who was 10 and possessed of an intelligence that outpaced nearly every formal educational opportunity available in Harlow County, Arizona Territory, was sitting on the top fence rail with a book propped on his knees. He was reading about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and simultaneously providing his older brother with what he described as helpful observations about equine psychology, which Eli did not want. And Caleb, who was 6 years old and deeply committed to the idea that he could keep up with his brothers in all things, was attempting to climb the fence to sit beside Thomas and had gotten himself sideways on the second rail and was stuck there making a sound like an upset cat. This was the Sullivan family on a normal morning. Loud, alive, slightly chaotic, and missing one essential thing. Jeremiah watched them and felt the thing he always felt when he watched them. Pride so large it crowded out everything else, followed immediately by a cold wave of fear. Because he was doing this alone. Because Mary had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that had swept through Harlow County in the winter of 1880, and the boys had survived the initial grief the way children survive things, by moving forward because they did not quite know how to stop. But they were growing. Eli was 4 inches taller than he had been at the start of the year, and asking questions that Jeremiah did not always have the answers to. Thomas was reading at a level that surpassed everything Harlow County's one-room schoolhouse, 12 miles away, could offer, and the schoolhouse had burned down the previous autumn anyway, which was how this whole situation had begun. And Caleb was 6 and had never known a mother's steadiness, and was the most sensitive of the 3 boys and tried hardest to hide it, which broke Jeremiah's heart on a regular basis. He needed help. He needed more than he was willing to admit he needed. The letter to the Board of Education had taken him 4 drafts over 2 weeks. He had stretched the truth on the schoolhouse because he was not wrong that it would exist. He was building it. It was just that the building was going slower than he had planned because a man running a cattle operation alone with the help of one hired hand named Cord, who was 60 years old and had opinions about everything, did not have unlimited time for carpentry. He had not expected them to send someone so quickly. He had not expected them to send someone like Rose Prescott. The file that had arrived a week before she did described her as a graduate of the Tucson Ladies Academy with 3 years of teaching experience in the mining settlements south of Phoenix. The file did not describe the way she looked at a situation and seemed to see through to the center of it immediately. It did not describe the quality of her stillness when she was thinking, which was the kind of stillness that made the air around her feel charged. It did not describe the fact that she was 26 years old and had, according to the brief personal history she had submitted, left behind a situation in Phoenix that she did not elaborate on and clearly did not intend to elaborate on. She had her own dark past, Jeremiah would come to understand. She had her own hidden wounds that she carried the way people carry things they are not sure they are allowed to put down yet. But that was later. That first evening, she was standing in his kitchen looking at him with those direct brown eyes, and he was standing there having just told her the truth, and the silence was stretching out between them while somewhere in the house his sons were pretending not to listen. "I want to see the schoolhouse frame," she said finally. He blinked. "Now, now." He walked her out across the yard in the cooling evening air. The frame stood against the backdrop of the mesa, pale wood against red rock and violet sky. It was not much. 4 walls started, 1 wall finished, the beginning of a floor, but the bones were there. Rose walked around it slowly. She pushed on the finished wall to test it. She examined the wood, the spacing of the uprights, the quality of the lumber. She stood in the open center where the floor would be and turned in a slow circle. "How long to finish it?" she asked. 6 weeks if I work on it every evening and Cord helps on weekends." 4, she said. He opened his mouth to argue. "I can help with carpentry," she said, and she held up a hand that had calluses on it in places that surprised him. "My father was a builder before he was a rancher. I grew up with a hammer in my hand." She lowered the hand. "I will conduct school here in the mornings. I will help with the construction in the afternoons. And you will pay me the wage the board specified, and we will operate this school on the honor system until the building is complete." "And where will you conduct school until it is complete?" he asked. She looked at him. "In your kitchen," she said, "unless you have a better suggestion." He did not have a better suggestion. "There is a spare room off the back of the house," he said. "It was a sewing room. It is empty now." He paused because every conversation eventually hit that quiet wall, the absence of Mary, the the room that had been hers and was now just a room with the implication of her still in it. "You can have it." Something in her face shifted. She heard the thing he did not say. "Thank you," she said, and it was simple and it was genuine and it did not carry any of the awkwardness that he had expected. They went back inside, and Jeremiah introduced her to Thomas and Caleb, who were sitting at the kitchen table looking up at her with two entirely different expressions. Thomas was calculating, assessing, filing information away. Caleb was staring with his mouth slightly open because he had not expected her to be pretty, which was a thought he did not have the vocabulary to process. "Where is your other son?" Rose asked. "Barn," Jeremiah said. "I will meet him tomorrow," she said, and she said it the way a general says a thing has already been decided. That night, after the boys were in bed and the house had settled into its night sounds, Jeremiah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a ledger he was not actually reading, and he thought about the woman in the back bedroom and the way she had looked at the schoolhouse frame and said 4 weeks like she was not uncertain about a single thing. He did not know what to make of her. He knew he was relieved she had not left. He knew that relief was about his sons. He told himself it was entirely about his sons. He told himself that several more times before he went to bed. The next morning, Rose Prescott met Eli Sullivan. She had been up since before sunrise, which was a fact that Jeremiah discovered when he came downstairs at 5:30 and found a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and a note on the table that said she had gone to look at the pasture. He found that detail quietly alarming in a way he could not explain. Eli came in for breakfast at 6, stomped mud off his boots at the door, hung his hat on the peg, and stopped dead when he saw the woman sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a ledger of some kind. "You must be Eli," she said. His jaw tightened. He had his father's look, the one that said he had already made up his mind. "I am not doing school," he said. "All right," she said. He blinked. He had expected an argument. He had been ready for an argument. He had, in fact, been composing arguments since last night. "I am 14, he said. "I know enough." "Enough for what?" she asked, and she asked it with genuine curiosity, not as a trap, not with judgment, just as a real question. He opened his mouth and then closed it. "Enough to run a ranch," he said. "Do you know how to read a deed?" she asked. "Do you know how to calculate interest on a bank loan? Do you know what the Homestead Act of 1862 says about land rights, and why that might matter to someone who wants to inherit and expand a cattle operation someday?" He stared at her. "I'm not asking those questions to embarrass you," she said. "I'm asking them because those are the things I want to teach you, not letters and numbers. You already know those." She paused. "I read your father's letter to the board. He mentioned that you help manage the herd records. That tells me you are capable of learning things that are actually useful." The kitchen was very quiet. Eli looked at his father, who was standing by the stove with a carefully neutral expression. "I'm not sitting at a desk like a child," Eli said finally. "No," Rose agreed. "You can stand up if you like." Something very nearly like a smile moved across Eli's face before he killed it. He sat down at the table across from her and did not say anything else. That was how it began. The school in the kitchen of the Sullivan house ran every morning from 7 until noon. Rose had brought with her a trunk of books and materials that she had assembled over 3 years of teaching in places where formal supplies were scarce, and a teacher had to make do. She had McGuffey's readers for Caleb, who was learning to read with a ferocious intensity that seemed to surprise even him. She had advanced arithmetic and early algebra for Thomas, who consumed mathematics the way other children consumed candy, and immediately began looking for the edges of whatever problem he was given. And for Eli, she brought out the books she kept in the bottom of the trunk, the ones about law and finance and land management, things that looked less like school and more like the future. Jeremiah watched from the doorway sometimes, when he had a reason to be near the house. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on things. He told himself that watching a woman teach his sons how to think was not the kind of thing that made a grown man feel things he was not prepared to feel. He was not entirely honest with himself in those early weeks. What he saw was this: Rose Prescott taught differently than anyone he had ever observed teaching. She did not stand at the front of a room and recite information while children sat still and absorbed it. She moved. She asked questions. She made Thomas explain his mathematical reasoning out loud, and she would challenge his explanations not because they were wrong but because she wanted him to be able to defend what he knew. She sat on the floor with Caleb and traced letters in the dust with her finger before they used paper, because she said some children understand through their hands before their eyes. She had long arguments with Eli about the interpretation of historical events that sometimes lasted until the boys were supposed to be doing chores, and she would stop herself mid-sentence and say, "We will finish this tomorrow," and Eli would go out to do his chores still arguing under his breath. She was extraordinary. Jeremiah could see that clearly. He was also trying very hard not to look at her for too long at a time, because he had noticed that looking at her for too long did something inconvenient to his concentration. For weeks, she had said. She had said they would finish the schoolhouse in 4 weeks. She kept her word. The construction was a thing that started as practical and became something else entirely without Jeremiah quite being able to identify when the shift happened. He would work on the frame in the evenings, and she would come out after the kitchen was cleaned and the boys were settled, and she would work beside him. She had not exaggerated her experience. She knew how to use a hammer and a saw. She knew how to read a level. She was methodical in a way that complemented his tendency to push forward and figure out the problems when he encountered them. They talked while they worked, not about anything consequential at first. She asked him about the land, about the history of the ranch, about how he had come to be in Harlow County, Arizona. He told her about coming out from Tennessee in 1870 as a young man with a head full of stubborn optimism, about finding the land, about the slow years of building something real out of dust and stubbornness. About Mary. He did not talk about Mary easily, but Rose did not push. She listened when he offered, and she did not fill the silences with false comfort, which was the thing he had always found most difficult about other people's attempts to acknowledge his grief. She let the silences be silences. One evening, about 2 weeks into the construction, she dropped a hammer and she said a word under her breath that was not appropriate for a schoolteacher. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she laughed, suddenly and without any of the careful composure she usually carried, and it was the most startling and beautiful sound he had heard in 3 years. He laughed too. He could not help it. They stood there in the half-built schoolhouse in the Arizona dusk laughing like two people who had not laughed in a very long time and needed to very badly. That was the evening something changed between them. Not dramatically, not with declarations or gestures. Just a slight warming of the air between them. A recognition. He noticed things after that. The way she always had a small book in her apron pocket because she read whenever she had a spare minute. The way she was patient with Caleb in a way that understood him specifically, that recognized his sensitivity without treating it as a fragility. The way she argued with Eli as an equal and he had begun, reluctantly and with great resistance, to respect her for it. The way she took her coffee without sugar because she said sweetness in coffee felt like a lie. He noticed things and he told himself that was fine. A person could notice things. Then Thomas found the letter. It was a Tuesday morning and Thomas was looking for extra paper in the trunk Rose kept her materials in, and he found, tucked beneath the books, an envelope addressed to a Miss Rose Prescott in care of the Tucson Ladies Academy, and the return address was a law office in Phoenix. The envelope had been opened. Thomas, who was 10 years old and genuinely did not understand why some information was private, read the letter. He did not tell Jeremiah first. He told Eli. Eli, who was 14 and old enough to understand more, took the letter to his father that evening. Jeremiah read it slowly. The letter was from a lawyer named Hargreaves, representing a man named Edwin Garth. It informed Miss Prescott that Mr. Garth's offer to resolve the matter of the promissory note signed by her late father remained open. The note, the letter stated, was in the amount of $800. Mr. Garth was, according to the letter, willing to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for Miss Prescott's agreement to marry him at her earliest convenience. The letter noted, in the careful language of legal documents, that if the debt remained unresolved, it would be forwarded to the territorial court for collection, and as Miss Prescott was the named heir of her father's estate, she would bear full responsibility. Jeremiah set the letter down on the kitchen table. $800. In the Arizona Territory in 1883, $800 was not a small thing. It was the price of a good parcel of land. It was more money than Rose would earn in a full year of teaching. It was a trap, and whoever Edwin Garth was, he had constructed it with care. This was her hidden motive for taking a position so far from Phoenix. Not hidden in a dishonest way, but hidden in the way people hide things they are ashamed of, things they are afraid of, things they are desperately trying to handle alone. He sat with the letter for a long time. He did not read it again. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and walked into the kitchen and put it on the table where she would find it with a note from him that said simply, "I did not read this looking for secrets. My son did not understand what he had found. I am sorry. J.S." He went to bed without seeing her that evening. The next morning she was already up when he came downstairs. She was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and the letter in front of her. Her face was very still. He sat down across from her. "I should have told you," she said. "You did not owe me that information," he said. "I owe you the truth about why I am here." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were clear, but the effort to keep them clear was visible. "I did not come to Harlow County solely because your schoolhouse needed a teacher. I came because I needed to be somewhere Edwin Garth was not. Somewhere long enough to earn enough to pay the debt honestly or find another way." She paused. "It was not a betrayal of this position or of your sons. I genuinely want to teach them, but I should have been honest." "Edwin Garth," Jeremiah said. "Who is he?" She was quiet for a moment. "He was a friend of my father's. He became more than a friend to my father's business affairs in the last 2 years of my father's life. After my father died, I discovered that many of the business decisions made in those last 2 years had been made under Mr. Garth's influence, and not always in my father's interest." She stopped. "I cannot prove it. The promissory note is real. My father signed it. Whether he fully understood what he was signing is a question I cannot answer now because my father is no longer here to answer it." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "How old is Edwin Garth?" he asked. She looked at him. "He is 53, she said. "I am 26, if that is the next question." It was. "The answer is no," she said. "I would not marry him under any circumstances, but what he holds over me is real." Jeremiah nodded slowly. He wrapped his hands around his own coffee cup. He thought about what he was going to say before he said it. "I have a friend in Tucson," he said. "A lawyer named Patterson. He is honest, which is a thing worth remarking on. I can write to him and ask him to look at the note." He paused. "Not as a solution, as information. You should know what you are dealing with from a legal standpoint." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was complicated. She was not accustomed to being helped. He could see that clearly. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because you are teaching my sons," he said. And then, because it was true and it would have been dishonest not to say it, he said, "And because I do not like the picture of someone constructing a trap around a person who does not deserve one." She looked at the table. She looked back up at him. "Thank you," she said. And this time when she said it, it carried more weight than the first time. He wrote to Patterson that afternoon. Life on the Sullivan ranch continued in its daily rhythm while they waited for the response. The schoolhouse was completed in its 4th week exactly, as Rose had promised, and the morning she hung the small handmade sign above the door that said, "Sullivan Schoolhouse," was a Saturday, and all 3 boys were there to see it, and even Eli did not say anything disparaging, which Jeremiah counted as a significant victory. There was a celebration of sorts that evening, which consisted of Rose baking a pie with the dried apples from the cellar and Jeremiah producing a bottle of good whiskey that he shared with Cord, who had helped with the final week of framing and accepted a slice of pie with the gravity of a man receiving a medal. Cord was 60 years old with a face like weathered saddle leather and opinions that he distributed freely on all subjects. He had worked the Sullivan Ranch for 8 years. He had watched Jeremiah lose Mary and continue on. He had watched the boys grow up in the specific chaotic way of boys who have lost a mother and have a father who loves them fiercely, but does not always know exactly how to show it. He watched Rose Prescott cut pie and laugh at something Thomas said, and he looked at Jeremiah with an expression that contained an entire commentary. Jeremiah ignored it. He was getting better at ignoring it, though not as good as he needed to be. The boys were changing. It was gradual, and then it was sudden, the way these things always are. Caleb, who had started the school session sitting as far from Rose as the kitchen table allowed, now sat directly beside her every morning and would slide his completed work across to her with the barely contained excitement of a child showing someone something they have made with their hands. He was reading simple sentences by the end of the second week and proper pages by the end of the third, and he read to anyone who would listen, including the barn cat, who he cornered in the hayloft with a copy of McGuffey's Reader and gave a full recitation. Thomas was in a state of continuous intellectual excitement that expressed itself as questions. He asked Rose questions at breakfast, and at lunch and sometimes in the evening when he was supposed to be doing other things. She answered most of them, referred him to books for the ones that required deeper research than she could provide offhand, and occasionally told him that some questions had no answer yet, which was information that he found both frustrating and thrilling. Eli's transformation was the slowest and the most complicated, and Jeremiah watched it with particular attention. The boy had built walls around himself in the 3 years since his mother's death. He was capable and he was responsible, and he worked harder than most grown men, but he had decided somewhere in his grief that needing people was a dangerous thing, and the way to be safe was to need as few as possible. He had been managing his younger brothers, filling the space he perceived as empty, being more than 14. It had made him older than he was in ways that were not always good. Rose seemed to understand this without being told. She did not treat Eli with sympathy, which would have made him withdraw. She treated him with respect. She gave him difficult things to think about and then stepped back and let him think about them. She disagreed with him openly and let him disagree with her and did not need either of them to win. One afternoon she gave him a copy of the Homestead Act and a copy of the Arizona Territorial Land Statute, and asked him to find the contradiction between the two documents and come up with a question for her that she could not answer. He spent 3 evenings on it. He found the contradiction. He came up with the question. She could not answer it. "I don't know," she told him, and she said it without any embarrassment. "I don't know, and that means you should write a letter to the Territorial Land Office and ask them, because that is an actual question worth an actual answer." He wrote the letter. He received a reply 4 weeks later that impressed even Thomas. Jeremiah saw the change in Eli's posture after that. Something shifted in the way he carried himself. Something eased. The letter from Patterson arrived on a Wednesday. Jeremiah handed it to Rose unopened, and she opened it at the kitchen table while the boys were at lunch, and Jeremiah sat across from her without pretending he was doing anything else. Patterson's letter was thorough. He had located the promissory note through channels he did not specify, and had examined it against the records of the Phoenix Commercial Registry. His findings were careful and qualified in the way legal findings are, but the substance was this. Edwin Garth had engaged in a practice of offering financial assistance to small landowners and businessmen, and securing that assistance with promissory notes that contained collection terms far more aggressive than the borrowers typically understood. 3 other cases with similar signatures were currently under examination, by the Territorial Attorney General's office. Patterson could not promise a resolution, but he believed the matter was worth formal scrutiny, and he had taken the liberty of submitting Rose's situation as a related case. He also wrote at the end of the letter that it might be some months before the process moved, and in the meantime the debt remained technically enforceable, and he advised Miss Prescott not to return to Phoenix until the matter was settled. Rose set the letter down. She was quiet for a long moment. "It might be resolved," she said. "It might be," Jeremiah agreed. "It might not be. It might not be," he paused, "but you are not alone in it." She looked at him. She had a way of looking at him, sometimes that felt like something was being examined, and also like something was being understood. It was a disconcerting thing, and he was, by this point in time, entirely accustomed to being disconcerted by her. "I am not sure I know how to accept that gracefully," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "Generally speaking." She almost smiled. "Is that a commentary on yourself?" "It is a commentary on a man who has been trying to do everything alone for 3 years and is becoming aware that it is not entirely working," he said, and he said it simply, without drama, the way he said things that were true and difficult. She was quiet for a moment. "We are a pair," she said softly. He held her gaze. "I suppose we are." That was the moment. Not a kiss, not a declaration. Just two people looking at each other across a kitchen table in the Arizona Territory, and seeing something in the other person's face that made the space between them feel smaller than it had before. It was late May. June came in hot and dry, the way Arizona June always did, like the land was remembering what it was made of. The boys adjusted to summer by waking earlier and working harder in the cool mornings, and moving slower in the heavy afternoons. Rose shifted the school schedule to match, starting at 6 in the morning and finishing by 10, leaving the rest of the day for ranch work and the particular curriculum she had begun conducting in the field, which was not formal schooling by any definition, but which the boys did not seem to object to. She walked the land with them. She asked Eli to explain how he knew where the cattle should graze in different seasons, and then she connected his practical knowledge to the geography and biology that underlay it in ways that interested even him. She had Thomas map the property, an exercise that began as a mathematics problem and became an obsession that lasted 2 weeks, and produced a map of the Sullivan Ranch that was more detailed and more accurate than anything that had previously existed. She had Caleb identify plants and write their names in his composition book, which was a reading and writing exercise disguised as something else entirely. Jeremiah watched and thought that what she was doing was teaching them to think, not just to recite. He thought that this was the difference between a person who taught because it was a job and a person who taught because it was what they were for. He was falling in love with her. He understood that clearly by the middle of June. He understood it, and he did not rush it, because he was a careful man, and because she had not given him any clear indication that the feeling moved in both directions, and because she was dealing with enough without him adding something complicated to the equation. But there were moments. The evening she came out to the pasture where he was checking the fence line on the north side, and she walked beside him without saying anything for a quarter mile, just walking alongside him in the cooling air, and then said, "Your youngest cried today." He found a picture of his mother in one of the boxes in the schoolhouse, and he did not know what to do with it. Jeremiah stopped walking. He turned to look at her. "What did you do?" he asked. "I sat with him," she said. "We looked at it together. He told me everything he could remember about her, which was more than you might expect from a child who was 3 when she died. Children hold more than we think they hold." She paused. "He wanted me to know about her. I think he wanted to make sure I knew she existed and mattered." Jeremiah could not speak for a moment. "He does that," he said finally. "He is the one who misses her the most openly." "He is the one who is allowed to," Rose said quietly. "His brothers have decided they have to be strong. He has not decided that yet. It is a gift, I think, even if it does not feel like one." He looked at her in the long evening light, and he thought that she understood something about his family that had taken him years to see clearly. "Rose," he said. He had been calling her Miss Prescott consistently for nearly 2 months, and the shift in how he said her name surprised both of them. She looked at him. He did not say any of the things he was thinking. He was not ready to say them, and it was not the right moment, but he held her gaze for long enough that something was communicated between them that did not require words. "Jeremiah," she said, and the way she said it, with all 3 syllables given equal weight, made his chest feel tight in a way that was not unpleasant. They turned and walked back toward the house. The crisis, when it came from the direction he had not been watching. It was the first week of July, and a man rode up the Sullivan property line on a horse that cost more than anything Jeremiah owned except the land. The man wore a suit that was entirely inappropriate for the heat and had the kind of face that was handsome in a constructed way, like it had been arranged to convey a specific impression. He said his name was Edwin Garth. Jeremiah was at the barn when he arrived. Rose was at the schoolhouse with the boys, who were doing a morning session even though it was past the usual time, because Thomas had gotten interested in something and declined to stop until he had worked it through. Garth introduced himself to Jeremiah with the careful bonhomie of a man who wanted to appear less threatening than he was. He said he had made inquiries and understood that a Miss Rose Prescott was in the employ of the Sullivan Ranch. He said he had come a long way and he hoped he might have a word with her. He said all of this pleasantly, but underneath the pleasantness was the thing that Jeremiah recognized immediately: the controlled assurance of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple application of pressure. "She is teaching," Jeremiah said. "I will wait," Garth said. Jeremiah looked at him. "Mr. Garth," he said, "before you do anything here, I want you to understand something. I have been in correspondence with a lawyer in Tucson named Patterson who has advised me that the matter you hold over Miss Prescott is currently under examination by the Territorial Attorney General." He paused. "I also want you to understand that you are on my property and you are here uninvited." Something moved behind Garth's pleasant eyes, a recalibration. "Your lawyer in Tucson," Garth said. "Patterson is a meddler." "He is thorough," Jeremiah said, "which is what I pay him for." "Mr. Sullivan," Garth said, and his voice dropped some of its pleasantness, "I have a legitimate legal claim against Miss Prescott. I have traveled a significant distance to offer her, again, a resolution that is generous by any measure. I would appreciate—" "She will hear whatever you have to say," Jeremiah said, "and I will be present when she does." Garth looked at him for a moment. "You seem personally invested," he said. "I am," Jeremiah said, and he said it without any particular inflection that invited discussion. They waited. When Rose came out of the schoolhouse and saw Garth standing by the fence, she went very still. It was only a moment, half a second, and then she straightened her spine to a degree that would have seemed impossible given that she was already standing straight, and she walked across the yard with the kind of deliberate, controlled movement that Jeremiah now recognized as her way of managing something she was afraid of by refusing to let the fear change how she moved. She stopped a few feet from Garth. "Mr. Garth," she said. "Rose," he said, and the familiarity of the first name was clearly intended as a territorial marker. "You look well." "What do you want?" she asked, not rudely, just directly, because she was not going to pretend this was a social call. Garth made a gesture toward Jeremiah. "Perhaps in private." "No," she said. "Whatever you have to say, you can say here." Garth recalibrated again. He was a man who was very good at shifting his approach when the first one did not work, and watching him do it in real time was an instructive experience. "The debt stands at $800, he said. "I am prepared to reduce it to $500 and extend the collection date by 6 months, given that you have clearly made efforts to address your situation." He glanced around the property with an expression that communicated clearly what he thought of her situation. "Or we can continue to discuss the alternative arrangement I have previously proposed." "No," she said again. "Rose, the answer to both is no," she said, "and I am going to ask you not to come here again." Garth's pleasant face did something that was not pleasant. The territorial courts are not kind to people who default on signed notes, he said. I have been attempting to spare you that process. I would encourage you to reconsider. Mr. Garth. This was Jeremiah, and his voice had a quality that stopped Garth mid-pivot. I am going to tell you something plain. My lawyer has already corresponded with the Attorney General's office about your particular method of doing business. If you pursue Miss Prescott in the courts, you will do so under scrutiny that I suspect you would find uncomfortable. He paused. And I will personally testify to the contents of the letter you sent her in care of the Tucson Ladies Academy, which offers marriage as an alternative to a legal debt, which I understand is a practice the courts tend to examine with some interest. The silence was absolute. Garth looked at Jeremiah. Then he looked at Rose. Then he looked at the two of them together, and something registered in his expression that was more than recalculation. It was the look of a man who has just understood the geometry of a situation he cannot win. You are making a significant enemy, he said. I have had enemies before, Jeremiah said. Garth put his hat back on. He mounted his horse. He rode away without saying anything else back down the property line toward Harlow Station. Rose did not move until he was out of sight. Then she let out a breath that was long and controlled and contained approximately 6 weeks of compressed tension. She turned to look at Jeremiah. You called me your lawyer, she said. Patterson is my lawyer, he said. And he is helping you. The distinction seemed impractical to make in the moment. She looked at him for a long moment. You called Patterson's correspondence in. You implied the Attorney General was directly involved. Patterson's letter said the case had been submitted to the Attorney General's office, Jeremiah said. I did not say more than that. You implied more than that. I implied what I believe to be true, he said, which is that Garth does not want scrutiny and that the best way to protect you was to make him understand clearly that scrutiny exists. He paused. Was that wrong? She was quiet for a moment, a long moment. No, she said. It was not wrong. She looked down at her hands. I have been carrying this alone for a year. I did not want to need help with it. I know, he said. I am not sure how to thank you properly. You already have, he said. Every morning when I watch my sons actually learn something. Every time Caleb reads a sentence and looks up like he cannot believe he just did that. He paused. You have given this family something it needed badly. She looked up at him and her eyes were bright in a way that was not distress. It was something more complicated and more vulnerable than distress. Jeremiah, she said. Rose, he said. They were standing a foot apart in the July morning sun. I came here for one thing, she said quietly. To teach your sons. I stayed because she stopped. I have been trying to understand clearly why I stayed. Why it is that on the evenings when I lie awake I am not thinking about Phoenix or Garth or what happens next. I am thinking about, she stopped again. About, he said, and his voice was very quiet. About the way you talk to your boys, she said. About the way you look at this land like it is something you made a promise to. About the way you laughed in the unfinished schoolhouse when I dropped that hammer. She paused. About the way you never pushed me to explain anything, and then when you found out the truth you did not make me feel small for having needed to hide it. He looked at her for a long, still moment. I have been trying to be careful, he said. Because I did not want to make things complicated when you already had enough that was complicated. You have not made things complicated, she said. You have made things, she searched for the word, possible. He reached out and touched her hand, just that, just his hand covering hers. I do not know how to do this gracefully either, he said. I should warn you. I am a man who is considerably better at building fences than building sentences. Your sentences are fine, she said, and her fingers turned under his and held on. They stood like that for a moment in the quiet of the morning. Papa. This was Caleb from the door of the schoolhouse. Are we doing arithmetic today or are you two just going to stand there? They broke apart laughing. And that was that. July moved into August. The heat was extraordinary and absolute, and everything moved through it at a slightly reduced pace, except Thomas, who seemed to generate his own climate of intellectual energy regardless of temperature, and Caleb, who had discovered that if he woke up at 5 in the morning, he had 2 cool hours before the day got serious, and used those hours to read in the barn loft. There was an ease now between Jeremiah and Rose that had not been there before. Not the ease of people who have resolved something, but the ease of people who have stopped pretending they do not feel something. They were not reckless about it. They were careful in the way people are careful with things that matter. But the boys saw it, because boys see everything relevant to the adults in their lives. Thomas announced one evening at supper that, based on observable behavioral evidence, he concluded that their father and Miss Prescott were, in his words, developing a significant attachment. He said this with the tone of a scientist reporting a finding. Caleb looked up from his plate. "Is she going to be our mother?" he asked. The kitchen went very quiet. Jeremiah opened his mouth. He was not certain what was going to come out of it. "That is not a question you should ask," Eli said, in the voice of a 14-year-old who had decided to manage the situation. "Why not?" Caleb said. "I want to know." Rose, who had been in the kitchen doorway with a serving dish, set the dish down on the table carefully and sat down in her chair. "Caleb," she said, "I think that is a question that has not been decided yet." She looked at the boy with the directness she gave everything. "But I can tell you this. Whatever happens, I am not going anywhere anytime soon. And whatever happens, I am your teacher and I am your friend and I care about you and your brothers very much. That is not going to change." Caleb considered this. "Okay," he said, and he went back to his supper. Eli looked at Rose, then he looked at his father, then he looked at his plate. "As long as she keeps teaching me the land law," he said, "I do not have any objections." It was about as much of a blessing as a 14-year-old who had decided to be unmoved by things was capable of giving, and it was enough. Thomas said he had predicted this outcome 3 weeks ago. He was told to eat his supper. That night, after the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Jeremiah and Rose sat on the porch steps in the warm dark. The sky over the Arizona desert was extraordinary, the kind of sky that exists only in places where there is nothing between you and the stars. They sat close enough that their shoulders touched. "I owe you honesty," Jeremiah said. "You have always been honest with me," she said. "Not entirely." He was quiet for a moment. "When Mary died, I promised myself that was the end of that particular chapter of life. Not formally. I did not make a declaration. But I understood the loss as a final thing, not a temporary thing. Like I had used up what I was allowed." He paused. "I did not think I was capable of this again. I was not sure I deserved to be." She turned to look at him. "What changed?" she asked softly. He looked at her. "You came along and made it seem like something still possible," he said. "And I was not expecting that, and I did not know how to handle it with any grace at all." He paused. "I still do not." "I do not need grace," she said. "What do you need?" She thought about it for a genuine moment, which was typical of her because she took questions seriously. "Honesty," she said, "which you have given me, and steadiness, which you are." She paused. "And someone who does not need me to be smaller than I am." "You are exactly the right size," he said, and he said it with a straight face, and she laughed, surprised again, and the laugh went out into the desert night like something released. He kissed her then, carefully and then less carefully, like a man who has been trying to do something right for a long time and has finally permitted himself to do it. She kissed him back with the same certainty that she brought to everything else. They sat on the porch for another hour talking about nothing consequential and everything important, and the stars moved in their enormous arcs overhead. August became September, which in the Arizona territory meant the heat began to consider stepping back, only slightly, only enough to be noticed. The landscape shifted, the desert grasses went to gold, the light changed angles, and the Sullivan Ranch moved into the fall rhythms of work that were different from summer rhythms but equally demanding. The news from Patterson came in the middle of September. The Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into Edwin Garth's financial practices. 3 cases besides Rose's had been documented, and the picture was consistent enough that the territorial court had issued a hold on collection proceedings, involving Garth's promissory notes pending the outcome of the investigation. Rose's debt, Patterson wrote, was in a legal limbo that effectively protected her from collection for the duration of the investigation, which he estimated would take 6 to 12 months. Furthermore, Patterson had discovered that the promissory note signed by Rose's father contained language that had been altered from the original draft version, a fact he had established by locating the draft in the records of a Phoenix notary who had been present at the signing. This was, he wrote carefully, a significant finding. Rose read the letter 3 times. Then she put it on the table and sat very still. Jeremiah waited. "He altered the document," she said. "That is what Patterson found. My father signed something he thought said one thing and it said another." She paused. "I knew it. I could not prove it, but I knew it." "Now you can prove it," Jeremiah said. She looked at him. The relief in her face was complicated and layered. There was the practical relief of a person whose immediate problem has been significantly addressed, and underneath that was something older and deeper, the relief of being believed, of having the thing she knew to be true turn out to actually be true. "It is going to be all right," he said. "I know," she said, and she sounded like she actually knew it. She wrote to Patterson with her full account of the relevant events and her recollections of specific conversations with Garth in the months after her father's death, things she had cataloged carefully in her own memory, without ever having reason to believe they would be useful. Patterson replied that her account was exactly what the Attorney General's office had asked for. Edwin Garth, as it turned out, had been doing this for years. The investigation ultimately uncovered 7 cases with similar patterns. He was brought before the territorial court in the spring of 1884 and found liable for fraudulent modification of legal documents in 3 of those cases. The notes were voided. The debt against Rose Prescott's father's estate was declared invalid. But that was months away yet. In September of 1883, Rose knew it was likely to be all right, and that was enough. In October, Jeremiah asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically because he was not a dramatic man. He did it on a Saturday morning when the boys were out doing chores and the kitchen smelled of the coffee she had put on and the sage that came through the open window on the cool autumn air. He had been thinking about how to say it for 2 weeks and had arrived at the conclusion that he would just say it. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you want that. I think you know everything relevant about what it would mean. The boys, the land. This life." He paused. "I cannot promise it will be easy. I can promise that I will try to be the kind of man worth being married to." She set her coffee cup down. "I have been thinking about this since July," she said. And he said, "And yes," she said. "Yes, obviously yes." He looked at her and felt something unlock in his chest that had been locked for a long time. "Obviously," he said. "Jeremiah," she said, with the kind of patience she usually reserved for explaining things to Thomas, "I have been in love with you since the evening you came back from the fence line and I told you about Caleb and the picture, and you could not speak for a moment. I have just been waiting for you to get here." He stared at her. "I thought I was being subtle," he said. "You were not," she said, and she was smiling in the way that made the corners of her eyes change. He laughed. And then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it. "They told the boys at lunch." Caleb said, "I told you," to no one in particular, with the vindicated air of a 6-year-old who has been proved right about something. Thomas said he had calculated a high probability of this outcome and had, in fact, already drafted a hypothetical speech for the occasion, which he would now have an opportunity to deliver. Eli said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I think that is good," and went back to his lunch. But his face was doing something it did not usually do, something quieter and less defended, and Jeremiah saw it and filed it away as the thing he had been hoping to see since the beginning. The wedding was simple. There was no reason to wait, and no one was served by elaborate preparation. They were married at the Harlow County Justice of the Peace on the 3rd Saturday of October, 1883. With Cord as witness and all 3 boys in their best shirts, which in Caleb's case meant the shirt with only one visible patch. The justice of the peace was a man named Avery who had been doing this job for 20 years and had seen every variety of union come through his door. And he said later to his wife that the Sullivan wedding was one of the ones that stuck with him, because both of them looked at each other during the ceremony with the kind of attention that was not about the occasion. It was about each other. Cord shook Jeremiah's hand afterward with great seriousness and said, "About time." And Jeremiah said, "Thank you for your input." And Cord said the input had been available for 2 months, but clearly certain people needed to come to things in their own way. Rose shook Cord's hand and said, "You are a good man." And Cord, who had not expected this and was not prepared for it, nodded 3 times rapidly and went to see to the horses. They went home. The schoolhouse was full by November. This had not been the original plan. The original plan was for the Sullivan schoolhouse to serve the Sullivan boys. But word traveled in the way that word travels in small western settlements, which is to say quickly and with embellishment. And by October the nearest neighbors, the Hatch family 4 miles east and the Delaney family 6 miles south, and a widow named Mrs. Beaumont with 2 grandchildren who had been living with her since her daughter died, all came to ask whether there was space. Rose said yes. There was always space. There were 9 children in the schoolhouse by November, ranging in age from Caleb at 6 to Eli at 14, and Rose taught them all in the specific, differentiated way she taught everything, finding what each one needed and giving it to them. The Hatch children, a brother and sister who were twins of about 8, had never had any formal schooling at all. The Delaney children, 2 boys of 12 and 9, had some schooling but were behind where she would have expected. Mrs. Beaumont's grandchildren were a girl of 11 and a boy of 7, and the girl, whose name was Ada, was quiet and very intelligent, and had been waiting for something to be asked of her that was equal to what she had inside. Rose asked it. She always did. The Sullivan Ranch also changed in the way that things change when there is a second adult who is fully present and engaged. It was not that Jeremiah had been failing before Rose came. He had been succeeding at the essential things with great effort and at considerable cost to himself. What changed was the cost. Things that had required everything he had now required somewhat less, because there was another person sharing the weight. He did not take that for granted. He had lived long enough with its absence to understand what its presence meant. Rose learned the ranch. She had grown up in a working household, and she was not interested in existing at the edges of the operation. She learned which cattle needed watching and which were reliable. She learned the fence lines and the water sources. She learned how to read the sky for the kind of weather that mattered and what to do about it when it came. She brought her own knowledge, the botanical knowledge she had been quietly accumulating, and what she knew about soil and seasonal patterns from her childhood in a farming community. And she began an experiment in the back of the kitchen garden that Jeremiah could not fully evaluate yet, but which she said would improve the yield significantly if the soil chemistry was what she suspected. She was right about the soil chemistry. Jeremiah told Cord that his wife was more scientifically informed about the land than either of them. Cord said he had been aware of this for some time. Christmas of 1883 was the first Christmas in 3 years that felt like a celebration rather than a requirement. Rose made it happen not through effort alone, but through the specific intelligence of someone who understood what each person in the family needed from the occasion. She knew Eli needed it to acknowledge his mother's memory without the acknowledgement becoming the whole day. She knew Thomas needed something intellectually stimulating, or he would be bored and make everyone else aware of it. She knew Caleb needed noise and warmth and the physical proof of abundance. She managed all 3 simultaneously, which Jeremiah thought was a feat that ought to have a formal name. He gave her a book she had mentioned once in passing, a botanical reference she had said was excellent but that she did not own. She looked at it for a long moment and then she looked at him and she said, "You remembered that." "I remember things you say," he told her. She pressed the book against her chest and looked at him with an expression that he had learned by now was what she looked like when she felt something very large and was not going to cry about it because she was Rose Prescott Sullivan, and she was not prone to visible emotion in company. But it was a near thing. They went to bed that night in the good quiet of a house that was full. All three boys asleep. The winter cold outside and the warmth inside, and the particular piece of a day that had gone the way a day is supposed to go. "Are you happy?" Jeremiah asked in the dark. It was a simple question and he asked it simply. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'm very happy." She paused. "Are you?" "More than I thought I was allowed to be," he said. She moved closer to him in the dark. "You are allowed," she said. "You have always been allowed. You just needed someone to say so." In January, Rose told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper, while the boys were doing their evening tasks, standing in the kitchen with the same directness she brought to everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "I'm a woman who has been paying attention to the details of most things my entire life," she said. "Yes, I am certain." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her in the kind of embrace that has real weight to it, both arms properly, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and allowed herself the luxury of being held completely. "All right?" he asked. "Better than all right," she said into his shoulder, terrified. "But better than all right." "Me too," he said. They told the boys the next morning. Caleb received this information with uncomplicated delight and immediately began making plans for the baby's education, despite being 6 years old. Thomas said he would need to research neonatal development, which was a sentence that made Jeremiah blink slowly. Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded, and his nod had something in it that was close to the expression he'd made at Christmas, that easing thing. "Good," Eli said, "just that." Spring came, and with it the resolution of the Garth case, which arrived by letter from Patterson in April. The fraudulent notes were voided. The debt was discharged. Edwin Garth was ordered to pay restitution to multiple parties and was barred from commercial practice in the Arizona Territory. Patterson's letter was characteristically understated in tone, but even through the legal language Rose could read his satisfaction. She read the letter at the kitchen table. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the small box where she kept the things that mattered: Patterson's first letter, the note Jeremiah had left when Thomas found the Garth letter, a drawing Caleb had made of the schoolhouse. She had no debt. She owed no one anything she had not chosen to owe. It was a lighter feeling than she had expected, not because she had not understood the weight, because she had been carrying it for so long that she had stopped being aware of how heavy it was, and now, without it, the absence felt like a thing she needed to consciously notice. Jeremiah found her sitting very still at the table. "Good news," he said. "Very good news," she said. He sat down across from her. "You look like a woman who is doing arithmetic on something." "I am doing arithmetic on how much of my life I have spent being afraid of that," she said, and she gestured at the folded letter. "And realizing that the answer is more than I thought, and also that it is over." She paused. "It is a strange thing, to put something down that you have been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying it." "I know that particular arithmetic," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "We have both put things down," she said. "And picked up better things," he said. The pregnancy progressed without particular difficulty, though the Arizona summer of 1884 was not the ideal backdrop for the final months of it. Rose continued teaching until June, when the heat and the size of her made it impractical to stand for 6 hours a day, and she arranged for the older students, primarily Eli and Ada Beaumont, to conduct the morning reading sessions under her direction. Eli, who had spent months absorbing her teaching methods, turned out to be surprisingly good at it. He was patient with the younger children in a way he was not always patient with his brothers, and he had Rose's directness without her particular warmth, which worked for him in a different way. Ada Beaumont was 15 now and had been studying with Rose for 7 months and had the look of a person who has been asleep and recently woken up. She absorbed everything. Rose had written to the Tucson Ladies Academy about her, not to send her away but to inquire about correspondence coursework, and the academy had provided a set of materials that Ada was working through with the determination of someone with a specific future in mind. Rose was lying on the porch in the July heat, watching the sky and reading when the baby decided that now was the time. She called for Jeremiah with a calmness that he later said was more frightening than panic would have been, and Jeremiah sent Cord on the fastest horse to fetch the midwife from Harlow Station, and then he came back and sat with Rose and was as steady as he could be, which was mostly steady with occasional visible moments of something else. The baby arrived in the early hours of a Sunday morning. He was a boy, 7 pounds, and loudly opinionated about his arrival, which Rose said was a trait she could identify. They named him Daniel James Sullivan, for Rose's father, whose name had been Daniel, and for Mary's father, whose name had been James. It felt right. It felt like a name that acknowledged what had come before without being trapped by it. Caleb, when he was allowed in to meet the baby, sat very still and looked at him for a long time with the expression of a person who is processing something significant. "He is very small," Caleb said. "You were that small once," Rose said. Caleb looked profoundly skeptical. Thomas had already read everything available in the household's collection of books about infant development, and had questions about brain formation that Rose promised to address when she was less exhausted. Eli looked at the baby with an expression that was very private and very genuine, and he said, "He looks like he has opinions." And Rose said, "I know, I think it is a family trait," and Eli almost smiled. The autumn of 1884 was one of those seasons that gets preserved in memory as a particular kind of good. The baby was growing steadily and sleeping somewhat less than his parents would have preferred, but he was healthy and vivid, and had an expressive face that kept everyone near him in a state of continuous delight. The schoolhouse was full again. The ranch was thriving. The fence on the north line was finally properly repaired, which had been a project of 3 years. Eli, who was 15, had formally taken on the herd management records, which had been a Sullivan father's job, and was doing it with a precision and a rigor that drew the notice of neighboring ranchers. He had sent 2 more letters to the Territorial Land Office. He had started, cautiously and without announcement, keeping a journal of ranch observations that was half management record and half something else, something more personal, though he would not have described it that way. Rose found the journal one afternoon by accident and read 1 page before she realized what she had and closed it and put it back exactly where she had found it. The page she had read was about the day his mother died, written from a 15-year-old's perspective with a 14-year-old's distance and a grown person's precision. She did not tell him she had seen it, but she thought about it for a long time. That evening she put a blank journal on the kitchen table near where he usually sat with his records, with a note that said, "For whatever you need to say. No one reads a person's own journal." He did not acknowledge it at breakfast, but it was gone by the afternoon. Thomas, at 11, had outpaced every formal educational resource available in the Sullivan schoolhouse, and was working through a correspondence program from the University of Arizona, which had opened in Tucson in 1885, and had a preparatory program for younger students that Rose had identified and applied to on his behalf. He was corresponding with an actual professor, a fact that made him insufferable in the best possible way and very easy to manage, because he was distracted by mathematics most of the time. Caleb turned 8 and learned to ride a horse properly, not the way he had been trying to do it since he was 5, which was too fast with too much confidence, but the way Rose had quietly insisted, with attention and patience, understanding the horse as something with its own perspective. He was, once he submitted to the actual teaching of it, a natural. Rose watched him from the fence one morning, sitting straight-backed on a quiet mare called Pepper, walking her through a figure-8 with real steadiness, and felt something so uncomplicated and warm that she had to take a breath. Jeremiah came and stood beside her at the fence. "He is good," he said. "He is good," she agreed. They stood shoulder to shoulder watching their son ride in the warm morning. "Our son," she said, testing the sound of it. "And our other sons," he said, "and our Daniel in the house making his opinions known about something. He is making his opinions known about the fact that he wants to be out here and no one is bringing him," she said. "I can tell by the pitch." He laughed. "You can tell by the pitch." "You will be able to tell by the pitch in about 3 more weeks," she said. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. The November morning was cool and clear, and the light was the particular gold that came in through the autumn air and made everything look like something that should be remembered. "I have been thinking," he said, about whether we need to expand the barn," he said, "and also about whether we should add a room to the house before the spring." He paused. "Daniel will need his own room eventually, and I am thinking about the fact that Daniel may not be the last." She looked up at him. "Is that a question?" She said, "It is an observation," he said, "adjacent to a question." She considered this in the particular way she considered things. "The observation is correct," she said. "The room seems practical. The barn seems necessary." She paused. "The rest of it seems like something we can discuss further." "That seems reasonable," he said. She smiled. He looked at her smiling in the November light and thought that there was no version of this moment he had ever imagined, and that it was better than anything he would have been capable of imagining, and that he was a man who had found something he had given up expecting to find. Spring of 1885 came in gentle and green, the best kind of Arizona spring, the kind that makes the desert look like it has been keeping a secret and has decided to share it. The cottonwoods along the dry creek were enormous with leaf. The cattle were fat in content. The schoolhouse had been given a new coat of whitewash by the older students as a project that Rose had orchestrated with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that people learn better when they have a stake in the thing they are learning in. The letter from the University of Arizona arrived in March. Thomas had been accepted into their formal preparatory program for the following year, which would require him to be in Tucson for the academic terms. He was 11 years old, and the acceptance letter was addressed to Mr. Thomas A. Sullivan, and he read it 4 times standing in the kitchen, and then put it down carefully on the table. Jeremiah looked at his middle son's face and saw about 8 different emotions in rapid sequence. "Is this what you want?" Jeremiah asked. Thomas thought about it, which was unusual because Thomas usually answered questions immediately. "Yes," he said. "And I do not want to go," he said. "Those are both allowed," Rose said. Thomas looked at her. "I will miss the school," he said. "I will miss—" He stopped. He was 11 and he was not practiced at this kind of sentence. "You will miss us," Rose said simply, not making it awkward, not making it more than it was. "Yes," he said. "We will miss you," she said. "And you will come back for the summers, and we will write. And when you come back you will have things to teach us, which I think you will find very satisfying." He thought about that. Then he nodded. "Acceptable," he said, which for Thomas was approximately equivalent to "I feel deeply reassured and loved." Jeremiah caught Rose's eye over Thomas's head, and she caught his look and held it, and between them passed the particular silent communication of 2 people who have been sharing a life long enough to have a language that does not require words. Ada Beaumont finished the Tucson Ladies Academy correspondence curriculum in April, and Rose spent an afternoon writing her the most detailed and specific letter of recommendation she had ever written, addressed to the Academy's director, who she knew personally. Ada sat for her entrance examination in Tucson in May, and passed with scores that made the examiner write a note in the margin of the report. When the acceptance arrived, Ada came to the schoolhouse to tell Rose, who was in the middle of conducting a reading lesson with 3 of the younger Hatch children. Rose excused herself and read the letter standing in the doorway and then looked at Ada and said, "I knew." And Ada, who was not a girl who cried, stood very straight and blinked 3 times rapidly. "Thank you," Ada said. "You saw it first." "It was easy to see," Rose said. "It was very clearly there." That evening Rose told Jeremiah about Ada's acceptance, and he saw something in her face that was not quite the same as her usual satisfaction at a student's success. It was something more personal. "She reminds you of yourself," he said. Rose was quiet for a moment. "She reminds me of what might have been possible," she said, "if I had had someone who treated the possibility as real when I was 15. She paused. "I had it later. I had the academy eventually, but Ada has it now, and now is better." "You are giving something you did not have," he said. "That is the most useful kind of giving," she said. Daniel was walking by May, which was aggressive of him but entirely in character. He walked the way he did everything, with a complete conviction that it was going to work, and a resilience in the face of falling down that his parents found both exhausting and admirable. He had Rose's directness and Jeremiah's stubbornness, and a laugh that was entirely his own, sudden and generous. Caleb took his role as older brother very seriously, and followed Daniel around the yard with the protective attention of a small sheepdog, narrating everything Daniel encountered in careful detail as though the narration was instructional, which maybe it was. Eli, who had declared in September of the previous year that he was done with school and was now running the ranch, which was somewhat true, occasionally sat with Daniel in the evenings, and told him things in a low, serious voice that Daniel could not possibly understand yet, but listened to with complete attention. Jeremiah watched this happen once without being noticed, and felt something move through him that was too large and too grateful to have a name. The summer of 1885 was full and loud and good. Jeremiah expanded the barn. He added a room to the house, a proper room with real windows, and Daniel moved into the small bedroom that had been Caleb's, and Caleb moved into the new room with the triumph of a child who has won something. Thomas left for Tucson in August for his first term at the university preparatory program. He was 12 by then, serious and slight, and carrying a bag that was 2/3 books and 1/3 actual clothing. Rose had packed the clothing portion and had included, without comment, a small framed drawing that Caleb had made of the family, all 5 of them, which was stylistically abstract but clearly affectionate. Thomas looked at the drawing before he packed it. He did not say anything. He put it carefully at the top of the bag where it would not be crushed. Jeremiah drove him to Harlow Station. They sat in the wagon on the way there, and Jeremiah talked about practical things, the schedule, the money he had put in the bank account at the Tucson branch, the address of a cousin who lived in the city and would be available if Thomas needed something. Thomas listened and nodded, and they sat in comfortable quiet for a while. Then Thomas said, "She is a good teacher." "She is," Jeremiah said. "She is a good mother," Thomas said in the precise, empirical way he said things that he had evaluated thoroughly. Jeremiah looked at his son. "Yes," he said, "she is." Thomas nodded. He looked at the road ahead. "I am glad you asked her to stay," he said. "She made her own choice to stay," Jeremiah said. "Yes," Thomas said, "but you asked." He paused. "I am glad you did." They arrived at Harlow Station. They waited for the coach. When it came, Thomas picked up his bag and said goodbye to his father with a handshake that was very serious and not quite as uncomplicated as it seemed, and Jeremiah shook his son's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires, and Thomas got on the coach. Jeremiah watched the coach until it was out of sight. Then he turned the wagon around and drove home. Rose was in the kitchen when he came in. Daniel was asleep. Caleb was in the barn. Eli was out with the cattle. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Missing him already," he said, "which is ridiculous. He has been gone 3 hours. "It is not ridiculous," she said. She poured him coffee. He sat down at the table in the kitchen that had been the schoolroom and still was on some mornings, in the house that had been too quiet and was quiet again, but differently, not with the weight of absence, with the ordinary quiet of a day between things. "I keep thinking about the day you arrived," he said. She sat across from him. "You looked like you had been caught doing something you were not supposed to be doing," she said. "I had," he said. "I had misrepresented the schoolhouse significantly." "You had," she agreed. You also looked like a man who was drowning very slowly and was too stubborn to say so." "That was also accurate," he said. She smiled. He looked at her smiling and thought about everything that smile had learned to contain in 2 years. The patience, the warmth, the occasional flash of something that was very close to exasperation and very close to amusement simultaneously. The love, which was present in it now in a way that had grown from the careful thing it had been at the beginning into something that did not need to be careful anymore because it was sure of itself. "You stayed," he said. "I stayed," she agreed. "For the boys at first," he said. "At first," she said, "and then for the rest of it." She looked at him directly. "For you." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I am grateful every day," he said. "As am I," she said. They sat in the kitchen in the afternoon light, and outside the desert was going about its business in the way deserts do, without particular interest in the small important moments happening in the houses built on them. But those moments were happening anyway. They always do. Autumn came again. The seasons of the Sullivan ranch moved in their reliable cycles. The cattle went to summer pasture and came back. The schoolhouse filled and emptied and filled again. The children grew. The land held steady. Eli turned 16 and was running the north section of the ranch with a competence that made Cord, who was not given to compliments, say in Jeremiah's hearing that the boy had a better head for cattle than most men he'd worked with in 40 years. Jeremiah told Eli this secondhand and watched his son try not to show how much it meant. He showed it anyway. Caleb turned 9 in the fall and received as a gift a proper set of drawing charcoals from Rose, who had noticed that his abstract family portrait was not the first such drawing he had made, but merely the first anyone had looked at closely. He had been drawing on whatever surfaces were available since he was old enough to hold a stick. The charcoals were accompanied by a proper drawing journal, and Caleb disappeared into his room with both items and emerged 2 hours later with a detailed portrait of Daniel that was startling in its accuracy. Rose looked at the portrait for a long time. "Caleb," she said, "I need to write some letters." "About what?" he said. "About whether there is someone in Tucson who teaches drawing," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was trying not to be overwhelmed and not quite succeeding. "You think I am good," he said, in the voice of someone who has been hoping for this information but has been afraid to ask for it. "I think you are very good," she said. "I think you have been good for a long time and no one pointed at it and said so." She paused. "I am saying so." He put his arms around her. He was 9 years old and still at the age where this was something he did without calculating whether it was appropriate. And she held him and thought that she had arrived in this family to teach these boys, and the teaching had gone in directions she had never anticipated, some of it from her to them, and a great deal of it from them to her. What she had learned from these boys, from Eli's pride and Thomas's exactness and Caleb's openness and Daniel's irrepressible forward momentum, was something she could not have written in a curriculum. She had learned what it meant to be home. The winter of 1885 was mild by Arizona standards. Thomas wrote from Tucson every 2 weeks, long letters full of mathematical observations and occasional personal details that were more revealing than he probably intended. He had made one friend, a boy named Marcus, who was also from a rural county and also consumed by mathematics. He had joined the school's debating club, which Jeremiah read aloud to Rose while she was nursing Daniel, and they both laughed at the image. He came home for the Christmas holiday and was 3 inches taller and had opinions about city water systems that he expressed at length. He was glad to be home. He showed it in the way he showed all personal things obliquely, but he showed it. Rose knew, in the spring of 1886, that she was pregnant again. She told Jeremiah in the same kitchen, in the same direct way, on a Tuesday evening after supper. He was less quietly alarmed this time. He crossed the kitchen with the same certainty and held her with the same weight, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the same solidity of him that she had felt the first time and every time since. 2 more years, she said into his shoulder, and Daniel starts school. "And the one after Daniel," he said. "I suppose we'll start school 2 years after that," she said, and she felt him laugh against her hair. The pregnancy that spring and summer was different from the first, easier in some ways and more complex in others. She continued teaching through July, a stubbornness that the children in the schoolhouse found inspiring, and she arranged the summer sessions with the older students again, this time including a 16-year-old Eli who had become a genuinely effective teacher for the younger children in a way that surprised everyone except Rose. She had seen it. She had always seen it. She had just been waiting for him to see it too. In September of 1886, Rose delivered a girl. They named her Clara, for Rose's mother, who had died when Rose was 12, and who Rose held in the specific careful way people hold the memory of someone they loved early and lost too soon. Clara Sullivan arrived in the world with the same loud opinions as her older brother Daniel and a full head of dark hair that was clearly going to be Rose's particular shade of dark brown. Caleb said she was very small and also very loud, which were both accurate. Daniel, who was 2 and did not have a sophisticated framework for the concept of a baby sister, sat beside her in Rose's arms and looked at her with the expression of someone who does not yet know what they are looking at but is prepared to be interested. Eli held Clara on the second day, carefully, with the self-conscious carefulness of a tall 16-year-old holding something tiny. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment and then looked at Rose with an expression that was entirely undefended and entirely genuine. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." It was not a sentence he had planned. Rose could see that. It had come out because it was real and it was ready, and she had given him enough space to learn how to say real things. "You are very welcome," she said, "for all of it." He nodded and handed Clara back to her and went out to do the evening chores, because he was Eli and he expressed most things through work, and that was all right. Jeremiah came in a few minutes later and found Rose in the bedroom chair with Clara asleep against her chest, and the look on her face that he had no adequate words for, the particular look of a woman who has accomplished something enormous and is resting inside it. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Eli said something to you," he said. He had passed Eli in the yard and seen it in his son's face. "He did," she said. "What did he say?" She looked at her sleeping daughter. She looked at her husband. "He said thank you," she said, "for all of it." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. He looked at his wife and his daughter and felt the full weight of everything he had been afraid he would never have again, and it was a weight that was entirely unlike fear. It was the weight of something real and good and built slowly on honest ground. "He is right," he said. "We all built this together," she said. "That is the right way to understand it." He nodded. He looked at Clara's sleeping face. He looked at Rose. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Rose said. "Give her time." He smiled. She smiled back at him. The life they had made from the honest materials of difficulty and patience and choosing each other daily was full and present and continuous, and it would keep being that. The seasons would move through it. The children would grow through it. Thomas would come home from Tucson with his mathematics and his careful friendship and his long letters. Eli would grow into the man he was already becoming, honest and capable and less defended than he had been. Caleb would draw the world around him with increasing precision and love. Daniel would continue his aggressive forward progress through every stage of development. Clara would be herself, new and particular and entirely her own. And Jeremiah Sullivan, who had run out of people to ask and had sent a letter to a board of education with more optimism than accuracy, would continue to be the man who was exactly where he was supposed to be, on his land, with his family, beside the woman who had arrived for one thing and stayed for everything. And Rose Prescott Sullivan, who had come to a dusty, half-built ranch in the Arizona territory carrying a hidden wound and a trunk full of books, and a stubbornness that had kept her moving through things that would have stopped other people, would continue to teach and build and love with the specific, undivided attention that was her particular gift. Neither of them had arrived at this life gracefully. They had arrived at it honestly, which was better. On a Saturday morning in October of 1886, the Sullivan schoolhouse was full of children. 11 of them now, ranging from Daniel at 2, who was not technically enrolled but had decided he attended, to Eli at 16, who was assisting Rose with the older students and planning to continue to do so while simultaneously running the north section of the ranch. Rose stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse for a moment before she went in. She looked at the building, the whitewash, the sign above the door, the small window she had insisted on with good southern exposure for the light. Jeremiah came up beside her. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about the Tuesday morning she had stood in his doorway with mud on her boots and fury in her chest and told him he had lied. She thought about all the distance between that morning and this one, the evenings building this schoolhouse board by board, the kitchen table that had been a classroom, the fence-line conversations, the hands held in the dark, the children, the life. "I have been ready for a long time," she said. She walked through the door and into the morning, and the sound of the schoolhouse filled around her like something that had been waiting. Jeremiah stood in the doorway for one more moment, looking at his wife move through the room toward their children, and he felt what a man feels when he is standing inside the best thing he has ever managed to be part of, which is a feeling that does not have a name in any language but that is entirely unmistakable. He went inside. He was home.